Story 1.
I've never been a fearful person or one to believe in supernatural things, but after what happened that night last month, I can't sleep well anymore. I live in an old house on a quiet street in a residential neighborhood in Montana. It's one of those houses with a small garden in front and some windows that face the street. I've always enjoyed my nighttime routine of watching a little TV in the living room after dinner, with my dog Bob sleeping at my feet. That night was no different. Everything was normal, even too much. I remember it was around 11:30 p.m. when I decided to go to sleep. Bob had already gone to his room a while ago, and I was starting to doze off on the couch. I turned off the TV, checked to see if the front door was locked, like I always do, and started walking down the hall toward my room. That's when everything changed. You know that feeling when someone is watching you? That's exactly what I felt when I passed the living room window that overlooks the front garden. At first I tried to ignore it. After all, I was always skeptical about these things. But something made me stop and look. My heart froze instantly. On the other side of the glass, there was a girl. She must have been about 8 or 9 years old, with long dark hair, wearing what looked like a light-colored dress. But what made me panic were his eyes. Big, wide, and completely fixed on me. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They just stared at me. The worst thing is that I knew all the neighbors on that street, and I had never seen that child before. At that time, it was even stranger for a child to be alone on the street. My hands started to shake as I tried to process what I was seeing. I thought about calling someone, but I've been living alone since I got divorced 2 years ago. Bob, who always barks at anything different in the garden, remained strangely quiet in his room. I gathered courage and went closer to the window to try to get a better look, thinking that maybe it was just a lost child needing help. But every step I took towards the window made my entire body freeze even more. The temperature of the room seemed to drop suddenly, and I could see my own breath forming a mist in the air. That didn't make any sense. It was a hot summer night. When I got very close to the glass, I noticed something that made my knees weak. Through the reflection of the light in the room, I could see that there was no shadow on the floor. Everything went very quickly after that. I blinked for a second, literally 1 second, and when I opened my eyes again, she was gone. But not like a normal person who runs away. She just disappeared, as if it had never been there. I ran to the window and looked at all sides of the garden. Nothing. No sign of movement on the street. No sound of footsteps. Absolutely nothing. The night was too silent, a kind of silence that seemed to swallow everything. Even the crickets had stopped singing. My legs felt wobbly and I could hear my heart beating in my ears. At that point, finally, Bob began to whine in a way I had never heard before, a high-pitched, desperate sound. I ran to his room in a panic, trying not to think about what I had just seen. I found my dog huddled in the corner, shaking as much as I was. Bob is a 5-year-old Labrador. He has always been super brave and protective, but at that moment he looked like a scared puppy. When I approached him, I noticed that he was staring at my bedroom door, which was at the end of the hallway. His hair was all standing on end and he kept making that distressing sound. I tried to calm him down, but even I wasn't calm. My hand was shaking so much that I could barely stroke his head. That's when I noticed that the hallway had become absurdly cold, much more so than before. It was as if there was an open refrigerator there, blowing cold air towards us. The scariest thing was that you could see the cold air forming a kind of mist that rose from the ground. At this moment, the lights in the corridor began to flicker. It wasn't like a normal power failure. It was a strange pattern, like someone was playing with the switch. Too slow, too rhythmic. And every time the light flickered, I thought I saw a shadow moving on the hallway wall. It wasn't my shadow, nor Bob's. It was smaller, the size of a child. But that wasn't the worst part. The shadow seemed to be approaching the room where we were, even though there was no one visible in the hallway. Bob began to growl softly, a sound that sounded more like fear than threat. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my body just wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed there, hugging my dog, watching that impossible shadow get closer and closer. Panic took over me when I realized that the shadow had stopped exactly at the door of the room where we were. My cell phone was in my pajama pocket, but my hands were shaking so much I could barely hold it. I tried calling the police, but there was no signal. I tried to open WhatsApp to ask someone for help, but the application wouldn't open. It was as if my cell phone had simply stopped working. At that time, I felt a strong smell of wet earth invading the room, mixed with something sweet and rotten that I can't explain to this day. Bob started crying even louder and curled up against me even more. The temperature continued to drop, and I could already see the vapor from our breath forming small clouds in the air. My legs were numb from the cold and fear. That's when I heard it. A childish laugh, low, coming from the hallway. But it wasn't a happy or normal child's laugh. It was an empty, lifeless sound that seemed to echo inside my head. Bob stopped crying immediately and remained completely still, as if he had frozen. The lights stopped flickering and the hallway became completely dark. In the midst of that darkness, I began to distinguish a small figure standing in the doorway. I couldn't see it clearly, but it was clearly the shape of a child. My heart almost stopped when I realized that she was closer than before, and that those same eyes that had stared at me through the window now shone in the darkness like two small bluish lights. The girl started to move towards us, but in a completely wrong way. Her movements were garbled, as if she were moving underwater. Every step she took towards us made the smell of wet earth grow stronger, and now I also felt a metallic taste in my mouth, as if I had bitten my tongue, even though I knew I hadn't. Bob was so glued to me that I could feel his heart beating uncontrollably. I tried to scream, but no sound came out of my throat. It was as if the air had become too heavy to pass through her. My legs didn't respond, and all I could do was watch that figure getting closer and closer, those glowing eyes fixed on me. When she got about 2 meters away, something even more disturbing happened. She tilted her head at an impossible angle, almost as if she had turned completely to the side, and broke into a smile. But it wasn't a normal smile. It literally went from ear to ear, showing teeth that were too small and dark to be a child's. At that time, all the lamps in the room exploded at the same time, raining shards of glass on us. Instinctively, I threw myself over Bob to protect him, closing my eyes tightly. The noise of the explosion was deafening, and for a few seconds all I could hear was a high-pitched ringing in my ears. When I finally found the courage to open my eyes again, she was gone. The lights in the hallway were back to normal, the cold was gone, and the strange smell was completely gone. I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting on the sofa in the living room with all the lights on and Bob lying on my lap, still shaking. I didn't have the courage to go back to the room, much less look out the window. I stood there, paralyzed, going over everything that had happened in my head thousands of times, trying to find some logical explanation. But there were none. The broken light bulbs on the bedroom floor were the only physical evidence that something had actually happened. As the sun began to rise, I finally managed to calm down a little. I called work saying I was sick and wouldn't go, I couldn't afford it. I took advantage of the fact that it was daytime and went to check the garden. I found something that made my blood run cold again. Small footprints in the dirt, as if they were those of a child, but they just stopped in their tracks. They didn't go anywhere, they just ended abruptly. It's been a month since that night, and to this day I still can't sleep properly. I installed security cameras throughout the house and bought motion detectors, but nothing unusual has happened since. Bob still gets agitated sometimes, especially at night, and refuses to go into that room. I had to turn it into storage and move my things to the guest room. I told this story to a few people, but most people think it was just my imagination or that I was too tired and saw things. Maybe they're right, maybe I really did imagine it all. But then why did the light bulbs explode? And those footprints in the garden? And the strangest thing is, since that night, every photo I try to take inside the house comes out with some kind of dark spot in the corner, like a tiny shadow. I know it sounds crazy, but I'm sure of what I saw. I just wanted to understand what that child was and why he appeared right at my house. Last night something happened that made me find the courage to share this story here. I was organizing some old boxes in the basement. Yes, now I only do this kind of thing during the day, when I found an old newspaper from 1987. The house belonged to my grandparents before it was passed on to me, so there's a lot of old stuff stored here. But what caught my attention was a small piece of news in the corner of the page. It talked about the disappearance of a 9-year-old girl on that same street. The black and white photo was a little blurry, but I recognized it. Those same big eyes, the long hair, even the serious expression was the same. The newspaper said that she disappeared one summer night after being seen playing in the garden of her house, which was exactly where my house is today. From what I understand, the old house was demolished years later and my grandparents built this one. Ever since I read this, I can't stop thinking, could it be that that child I saw was her? Why did she appear just now after so long? I wonder if anyone else has seen her here and hasn't had the courage to speak up. I wrote this report because I need to know if I'm not going crazy, if anyone else has gone through something similar. Every night now, before I go to sleep, I have the feeling that she is somewhere in the house, watching me. Bob barks at nothing sometimes, always looking in the same corner of the room. And yesterday I could have sworn I heard that giggle again, very softly, coming from the hallway. I don't know what to do. I don't want to move. This house is one of the few memories I have of my grandparents, but I also don't know if I can bear to continue living with this constant fear. If anyone here has experienced something like this or knows of a similar story, please tell me. I really need to know that I'm not alone in this. Story 2. I was never a fearful or superstitious person. I always kept my feet on the ground and tried to find rational explanations for everything. I've lived alone for 5 years in this house that I inherited from my grandparents, and nothing strange had ever happened around here, until that night last month. It was around 11 p.m. when I went down to lock the basement before going to sleep, as I always did. The basement was basically a storage room where I kept old junk, boxes of Christmas decorations, and some tools. I confess that I never really liked going down there. The place was naturally dark and stuffy, but nothing that really scared me. That night, I was especially tired after a busy day at work, and I just wanted to check if everything was in order so I could sleep. When I reached the end of the basement stairs, I reached out to reach the switch on the wall to the right. The fluorescent light took a few seconds to turn on completely, as it always did. It was at that moment that I heard it. At first I thought it was just the sound of the wind passing through some crack, but I soon realized it was different. It was like a whisper, very low, almost impossible to distinguish. I was paralyzed trying to understand where that sound was coming from. My heart started to race when I realized the whisper formed something that sounded like my name. I tried to convince myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks, but then the lights started flickering. It wasn't like a normal power failure, it was a rhythmic pattern, as if someone was playing with the switch. My hands started to shake and I felt a chill down my spine that I had never experienced before. The air felt heavy, as if the temperature had suddenly dropped, and I could see my own breath forming little clouds of steam. The whispering continued, now a little louder, and I was absolutely sure it was my name being called. It wasn't a male or female voice, it was something different, something I can't explain to this day. I tried to scream, but my voice just wouldn't come out. My legs felt rooted to the ground, as if my entire body had been gripped by some kind of paralysis caused by fear. The panic only increased when I noticed that the boxes stacked in the corner began to move on their own, as if someone was moving them from behind. It wasn't a sudden movement, it was small dragging and tapping, as if something or someone was looking for something inside. The lights kept flashing in that disturbing rhythm, and every time it got dark, I had the terrible feeling that there was a presence approaching me. I could feel it. It wasn't just impression or imagination, it was too real. The air grew thicker and harder to breathe, and that whisper of my name seemed to come from every direction now. I finally managed to regain control of my legs and took a step back toward the stairs. It was at that moment that I heard a deafening noise of several things falling behind the boxes. The sound was so loud and sudden that I let out a muffled scream and almost fell. My cell phone was in my sweatpants pocket, but my hands were shaking so much I couldn't hold it properly. I tried to turn on the device's flashlight, but it simply wouldn't work, something that had never happened before. I tried to make a call, any call, but there was no signal. It was as if all technology had stopped working in that basement at that moment. The banging on the boxes became more intense, and I could now clearly hear the sound of footsteps shuffling across the concrete floor. They weren't normal footsteps. They were like something was crawling towards me. The whisper of my name was louder and clearer, as if the source of it was getting closer. The light was now flashing so quickly that I could barely make out what was happening around me. In one of the moments of clarity, I saw something that made me freeze again. There was a shadow moving on the wall, but it wasn't my shadow. It was something completely different, a way I can't describe to this day without feeling my stomach turn. At that moment, I felt something cold touch my shoulder. It wasn't a firm touch. It was more like a freezing breeze that passed through my entire body. The smell of the basement changed completely. Before it was just the characteristic smell of mold and damp. Now there was a strong smell of wet earth mixed with something metallic, similar to rust. My breathing was so fast that I started to feel dizzy. Panic gripped me when I realized that the shadow on the wall was moving in a gravity-defying way, as if it was twitching. And the most frightening thing, she seemed to be trying to take on a humanoid form. The lights were now completely out of control, flashing at a frantic pace that made my head throb. The whisper of my name turned into something more guttural, as if several voices were speaking at once. That's when I noticed something even more disturbing. The voices weren't just calling my name, they were repeating something I couldn't understand, as if it were an ancient or unknown language. Between the flashes of light, I saw that the shadow had moved even closer, and now appeared to be less than a meter away. The air was so cold that my teeth were chattering, and that cold feeling on my shoulder began to spread throughout my body, as if something was trying to envelop me. My survival instinct finally overcame the fear that paralyzed me. On a desperate impulse, I turned my back and started running up the stairs, tripping on the steps. I could feel that presence coming behind me, as if I was being chased by something I couldn't see, but I knew was there. The sound of voices became even louder, echoing off the basement walls, and the smell of wet earth became unbearable. As I walked up the stairs, I felt as if invisible hands were trying to grab my ankles. My whole body was shaking and I couldn't stop crying, but I continued climbing, step by step, in a desperate race for my life. When I finally reached the top of the stairs, I slammed the basement door with all the force I could muster and turned the key in the lock several times, as if that could protect me from whatever it was down there. I fell sitting on the kitchen floor, panting and shaking uncontrollably. The strangest thing is that as soon as I closed the door, everything stopped. The voices, the smell, the feeling of cold. Everything disappeared as if it had never existed. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, paralyzed, for what seemed like an eternity, trying to process what had just happened. My cell phone started working normally again, as if nothing had happened, showing that it was 11:47 p.m. Less than an hour had passed since I went down to the basement. After that night, I was never able to go down to the basement alone again. I hired a professional to install security cameras down there, hoping to capture something that could explain what happened, but the recordings never showed anything other than normal. I also called an electrician to check the wiring of the lights, but he said everything was perfectly normal. I researched the history of the house, talked to old neighbors, tried to find out if something had happened there in the past, but nothing explained what I experienced. The most disturbing thing is that sometimes, especially at night, I can still hear that whisper coming through the basement door, calling my name, but now it's so quiet that I wonder if it's real or if it's just my mind playing tricks. It's been a month and a half since that night, and I still wake up in a cold sweat when I dream about that shadow on the wall. I try to convince myself that there is a logical explanation for all that, but deep down I know that I witnessed something that goes beyond my understanding. I changed my routine completely. I never go down to the basement after dark anymore, and I installed an extra lock on the door. The strangest thing is that every time I walk near the cellar door, my cell phone starts to malfunction. The screen flickers, the battery drops quickly, and calls get jammed. It's as if that presence is still there, waiting. I don't know what that was, I don't know what I wanted, and honestly, I don't want to find out. I just know that since that day, I've never been able to look at that basement the same way again, and the feeling of that cold touch on my shoulder still haunts me every night. Story 3. I woke up with that heavy feeling of someone who spent the whole night with the sound of rain pounding their mind. Still a little dazed, I sat on the bed and looked out the window. The glass was still fogged and small drops ran down the surface. The rain had stopped, but the air inside the room was damp and cold. That's when I felt a strange chill, the kind that runs down my spine for no apparent reason. The silence seemed thicker than usual, as if the house was holding its breath. I decided to get up and go to the kitchen. I needed a coffee to wash away that discomfort. But as soon as I opened the bedroom door, I almost stumbled backwards. There were footprints, wet, huge, and they followed from the hallway to the entrance of my room. My heart started to beat faster and a shiver took over my body. It was as if time had stopped for a second and, at the same time, everything became clearer and more defined. I live alone, and the front door was locked, as I always leave it at night. I got closer, holding my breath, and bent down to get a better look. The footprints were strangely shaped, something between a paw print and a human print, but with long, disproportionate fingers. The sensation of being watched invaded me so intensely that, for a moment, I thought I would hear heavy breathing behind me. I stood up slowly, feeling the muscles in my body tense, ready to react to anything. The hallway seemed darker than it should have been, even with the morning light filtering through the cracks in the windows. I followed the footprints with short steps, trying to make as little noise as possible. The wet texture of the marks looked freshly made, as if the water was still about to drip. Every detail made me more nervous. The mind raced with possibilities. An animal? Someone breaking in? But nothing explained those bizarre marks. I reached the room, and the sight paralyzed me. The footprints stopped abruptly in the middle of the carpet, with no sign of returning or where else they could have come from. It was as if whoever had left those marks had simply vanished into thin air. The silence was almost deafening, and instinctively I looked at the lock on the front door. Intact, just as I left it the night before. A chill ran down my back as I realized that the only logical explanation didn't make sense. I took a deep breath and took a step back, not knowing whether I should grab my cell phone or run out of the house. I decided to take out my cell phone, my hand shaking as I unlocked the screen. I turned on the flashlight and the bright light illuminated the hallway back to my room. The marks were still there, but now, with the contrast of the flashlight, I noticed something that had escaped me before. Small scratches on the sides of the footprints, as if sharp claws had touched the ground at the same time. My stomach knotted. A part of me wanted to believe it was a bad prank, but another, deeper and more irrational, knew it wasn't. Something had been there, and in an impossible way. I felt the weight of the house on me, the walls seeming to close in every second. With slow steps and a racing heart, I began to search every corner of the house. I opened doors, searched the bathroom, even under the bed, nothing. But the feeling that something was present wouldn't leave me. It was as if invisible eyes followed every movement, every breath. Finally, I went to the living room window and opened it, letting in the cold morning air. I needed a distraction, a sound, anything to break that oppression. The wind moved the curtains and, for a second, I thought I heard a soft rustling sound, as if something was moving outside, among the trees that surrounded the house. That little breather next to the window didn't help much. On the contrary, it made my brain go on high alert. I knew that if I wanted to understand what was happening, I would need to track every detail, no matter how absurd it seemed. I decided to look outside, craning my neck to see the garden soaked from the previous night's rain. The grass was still wet, but there was no sign of footprints that might have come from outside. It was as if the starting point was the middle of the hallway in my house. A wave of nausea washed over me, along with a primal fear I had never experienced. I returned to the hallway, with the flashlight still firmly in my hand. That's when I heard a dry noise coming from my room, something between a pop and a scratch. Instinct made me stop in that same second, and I held my breath. The sound repeated, but this time it sounded more shuffling, as if something was moving across the wooden floor. I wanted to run, to get out of the house, but my legs felt stuck to the ground. The idea that, at some point in the morning, something had entered and now could still be there, so close, made sweat run down the back of my neck. I took a deep breath and took a step toward the bedroom door, trying to ignore the dread that told me to do otherwise. With every step I took towards the room, the feeling of something watching me grew stronger. It felt like the air was thick, too thick for a normal morning. When I reached the door, I hesitated for a moment before shining the flashlight inside. The light revealed the room as I had left it, but something seemed out of place, as if a shadow was moving where there should be no movement. The crack was repeated, this time quieter and followed by a light scratch, as if nails scratching wood. My entire body reacted with an involuntary tremor, and my mind screamed at me to get out of there. But curiosity mixed with dread made me enter the room, with the flashlight dangling in my sweaty hand. I looked at every corner, from the closed closet to the chair next to the bed. It was then that I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. A deep mark in the wood of the floor, right next to the bed. It looked recent, as if it had been made recently. It was a long, curved line, accompanied by smaller ones, like claws that dragged carelessly. The panic I felt was no longer just because of the strangeness of the situation, but because of the realization that whatever it wasn't completely gone. My mind began to fill with unanswered questions as I stared at that deep mark. Who, or rather what, could have left that? And why were there no entry or exit signs? The thought that perhaps I was dealing with something beyond human understanding made me feel a biting cold throughout my body. I moved the flashlight away from the floor and began to illuminate the walls and ceiling again, as if hoping to find some more obvious sign. When the light touched the window, I noticed a slight condensation forming, as if someone had been breathing right next to it. With a lump in my throat, I approached and touched the cold glass. It was wet, but not like an ordinary house window on a cold morning. It looked like someone or something had touched it recently. The shape of the marks was sketchy, but enough to make me immediately back away. For a moment, I was paralyzed, until I heard a subtle, almost imperceptible noise coming from the corridor behind me. Something like restrained, muffled breathing. The atmosphere around me felt suffocating, and adrenaline took over my body. Without thinking twice, I quickly turned to face the empty hallway, but the feeling that I wasn't alone only grew. The empty hallway in front of me seemed to stretch endlessly, and the house, which had once been my refuge, was now a place of danger and uncertainty. The sound of breathing that I heard moments ago was still echoing in my head, making me wonder if I was losing my sanity. I took a few cautious steps, lighting every part of the floor, until I reached the entrance door. I wanted to get out of there, breathe the outside air, and try to get away from that nightmare. However, when I touched the doorknob, I felt a slight tingling in my fingers, as if a cold current ran through my hand. My instincts told me that I shouldn't leave, that the danger wasn't just inside the house. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my uncontrolled heart, and looked at the hallway one last time. It was at that moment that I noticed a new mark, just below the door frame, as if long fingers had scratched the wood before disappearing. The sight left me in shock, and, even without understanding how, I knew it was a warning. Something, a presence that defied logical explanation, had been there, watching, waiting. The feeling of helplessness overcame me, and for a moment I could only stand still, the absolute silence weighing on my ears. To this day, this memory makes me question what really happened that morning and whether it could ever happen again.